Not long after the end of the Second World War, in the middle of the 20th century, an entirely new conflict, the Cold War, set the world's two greatest powers against one another: the Democratic United States of America and the Communist Soviet Union. By the middle of the 1950s, the US-Soviet Cold War had worked its way into the fabric of everyday life in both countries. It was fueled by the arms race, the growing threat of nuclear weapons, and broad-ranging espionage and counter-espionage between the two countries. Nonetheless, these tensions would not be confined to just these fronts. The space would become yet another dramatic battlefield for this competition. On October 4, 1957, a Soviet R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, into Earth's orbit. Sputnik, which means traveler in Russian, was also the first man-made object that had traveled to space. The majority of Americans were taken aback by this feat launch and took it vitally important to not lose too much ground to the Soviets in the field of space exploration. For one, space was considered in the United States to be the next frontier, a logical extension of the great American heritage of exploration. In addition, the demonstration of the tremendous capability of the R-7 missile, which appeared to be capable of delivering a nuclear warhead into the airspace of the United States, made it extremely vital to acquire intelligence about the activities of the Soviet military. Thus, work began, and only a year later, in 1958, the United States successfully launched its very first satellite, Explorer-1, developed by the United States Army, under the leadership of rocket scientist Wernher von Braun. In the same year, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed a public order that established the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the federal agency dedicated to the exploration of space. But in addition to this, Eisenhower also established two other national security-focused space initiatives that would run concurrently with NASA. The first one, the Space Force, led by the United States Air Force, and focused on harnessing the military potential of space. The second, codenamed Corona, was led by the Central Intelligence Agency, the Air Force, and a new organization called the National Reconnaissance Office. Corona would use orbiting satellites to gather intelligence on the Soviet Union and its allies. The space race further heated up when in 1959, the Soviet Union's space program launched Luna 2, which became the first spacecraft to successfully land on the moon. Yuri Gagarin, a Soviet cosmonaut, was the first human to orbit the Earth in April 1961. He did it while piloting the capsule-like spacecraft Vostok 1, which was developed by the Soviet Union. On the other hand, NASA engineers designed a smaller, cone-shaped capsule for Project Mercury, the United States' effort to send a man into space. They tested the craft with chimpanzees and held a final test flight in March 1961, before the Soviets were able to pull ahead with Gagarin's launch. Though the Soviets won, Alan Shepard made history on May 5th by becoming the first American to travel into space. In the latter part of May of that year, President John F. Kennedy made the audacious and public assertion that the United States of America would successfully put a man on the moon before the turn of the century. And guess what? He actually did it. In February of 1962, John Glenn made history by becoming the first American to circle the Earth. By the end of the same year, the groundwork for NASA's lunar landing program, which was codenamed Project Apollo, was already in place. NASA's budget expanded up to 5 times sent between 1961 and 1964, and the lunar landing program eventually encompassed approximately 34,000 NASA personnel, in addition to 375,000 employees who worked for corporate and university contractors. However, in January of 1967, the Apollo program was dealt a blow when 3 astronauts were killed in a fire while practicing a launch. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union's lunar landing program proceeded cautiously, and this was in part owing to an internal dispute within the country over the program's usefulness, as well as the untimely death of Sergei Korolev, who served as the chief engineer of the Soviet space program. Apollo 8, the first manned space mission to orbit the moon, was launched in December of 1968 from a huge launch site operated by NASA on Merritt Island, which is located close to Cape Canaveral in the state of Florida. Fast forward 3 years, on July 16th, at 9:32 a.m. EDT, Apollo 11 lifted off from Kennedy Space Center, with astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins aboard. On July 19th, Apollo 11 entered lunar orbit after traveling 240,000 miles in 76 hours. The next day, at 1:46 p.m., Armstrong and Aldrin's lunar module Eagle detached from the command module and began its fall to the lunar surface. 2 hours later, at 4:17 p.m., it had landed on the southwestern border of the Sea of Tranquility, and this is when Armstrong instantly radioed a now famous message to Mission Control in Houston, Texas. The Eagle has landed. Armstrong opened the hatch of the lunar module at 10:39 p.m., 5 hours ahead of schedule, and as he descended the module's ladder, a television camera attached to the craft filmed his movements and transmitted the signal back to Earth, where hundreds of millions waited in suspense. As he stepped off the ladder and set his foot on the moon's powdery surface, he uttered the famous words, "One small step for man, one great leap for mankind." Thus, the United States won the space race, which had begun with the launch of Sputnik in 1957. From 1969 and 1972, the Soviet Union attempted 4 times to launch a lunar landing vehicle, but was unsuccessful every time. One of these attempts even resulted in a dramatic explosion on the launch pad. The public's attention in the US was captured by the space race from the beginning to the very end, and the many breakthroughs made by both countries received extensive coverage in the media. People on Earth began to view astronauts as heroes, and those on Earth appeared to take pleasure in living vicariously via the astronauts' experiences. But after the completion of the space race in the early 1970s, the interest of the United States government in lunar exploration began to diminish. During the Apollo-Soyuz mission, which took place in 1975, 3 US astronauts launched into space on board an Apollo spacecraft, and while in orbit, they mated with a Soyuz vehicle, which was manufactured in the Soviet Union. After exchanging formal greetings, the commanders of the 2 spacecraft were able to perform a handshake in space, and this rather small became a pretty big metaphor for the gradual thawing of relations between the United States and the Soviet Union during the waning years of the Cold War. But is it really the end of the conflict? Well, if you look at it from another angle, the space war did never conclude in the first place. While Russia has somewhat backed down, the US is faced with another foe. A new order is forming in space right now, a competition between America and China. But with the demands of space exploration, even these great powers will be unable to accomplish so alone. Hugely technically difficult and costly ambitions have been floated, not least the goal of people living and working on other planets within 10 years. The Artemis program has begun NASA's return to the moon. The first of 3 missions have been launched successfully. The first unmanned flight validated the rockets and technology. The second mission will transport humans further into space than ever before, and the third will land astronauts on the moon for a week to conduct research. The long-term ambition is to use the moon as a launch pad to reach Mars. But the scheme is expected to cost $93 billion, 76 billion pounds, a hefty price tag for the US taxpayer, who is already feeling the pinch. Even though NASA will receive less total funding than it requested in 2023, Congress currently supports its human space exploration efforts. China, on the other hand, has successfully launched its own fully operational space station, Tiangong, into orbit on time. China's space program has sent probes to the moon and Mars. It intends to build an unmanned research base on the moon by 2025, followed by the landing of astronauts on its surface by 2030. Though placing an astronaut on the moon has already been accomplished, the next step, to Mars, is far more challenging. The red planet is 250 times further than the moon, and no spaceship is currently capable of sending humans there. And even if scientists can devise a safe technique to launch a fuel-heavy rocket and land it on a planet with such a thin atmosphere, the astronauts must be safely returned home as well after months in space. This brings us to the end of this video. If you liked the video, please consider subscribing and sharing so we can keep bringing more content like this. See you next time.